I've always maintained Dianca London Potts for president, and that's president pre-apocalypse and post-apocalypse. She is omnipresent and authoritative. Dianca knows how to get stuff done. She's been a TA while I was a student at the New School, and she was a student in the MFA program. She and I have both taught at Pratt and Eugene College for Liberal Arts. More than anything, people will know her as a horror aficionado. That is her niche, but her knowledge extends so much further than that, as you will see in the episode coming up. A note about her omnipresence, she pops up in all types of places, like an episode of Girls, or like last fall when I was watching a documentary called The Witches of Hollywood, because it was, the autumnal thing to do, and I'm a little bit witchy. I watched the documentary, and here pops up the omnipresent and authoritative Dianca London Potts talking about the symbolism of witches across film and screen. So yeah, I hope you enjoy the conversation we have. We talk about sinners. We talk about him. We talk about vampires versus werewolves. We talk about Toni Morrison and so much more. So let's get into it. Welcome to Outsider In, the podcast featuring outliers who shape the center, and a place where Freddy Krueger is hilarious and everyday whiteness is the horror. I'm here with Dianca London Potts. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's a joy to convene in the midst of such a great mind as yourself.
Oh, well, thank you. I always feel the same way. Anytime you're in the room, I'm just like, the whole space has been elevated, including this virtual space. So tell folks, like, what is your interest in the genre of horror et al., and how does it influence your writing, and what is your earliest sort of attachment to that genre?
I think for many folks like ourselves, who find ourselves at the sort of tail end of being elder millennials, we grew up in a time that was really bendy and malleable in a way that I think we've seen shifts in genre, shifts in modalities of storytelling, and even identity in the aughts, and even more recently in the 2020s. But I think there was something really interesting about a world where you don't carry everyone you know in your pocket via your phone, a world where you have to wait to get that next Goosebumps book with those really cool, God, I miss the smell of them, the Scholastic newsprint catalog things, or a book fair. And also, I know they were everything. And I think also too, that sense of that. I remember at my Christian summer camp, the one summer, it was the summer that Big Blair Witch Project came out, and no one had really seen it, but many of us had seen the trailer. And so we all kept trying to make up what we thought it was about. And so there was this kind of what if where something was around the corner and we couldn't quite completely grab it or see it. Or know it completely. And so I think there was still this kind of wonder about story, and specifically even more so with horror. And I don't know if it comes from the more analog side of things that we were still kind of being shaped by from earlier generations who've come before us, with the 70s and the 80s. And then of course our Gen X elders. But I think that there's something really special about being an elder millennial and how that shapes how you see story and how you've been shaped by story. I think the earliest horror story I encountered was the Bible. That sounds like I'm trying to dig at a very ancient, large form of narrative. But I think that when you're little and you don't really know the difference between literal and metaphorical, or you think you do, and then someone at a pulpit tells you otherwise, it can be really shocking and interesting. But also there was something kind of familiar about being in that space of tension and not knowing if the world will end, or not knowing if you're going to go to hell or not knowing if eating more M&Ms before dinner is going to be the thing that tips you into the fiery lake. And so I think that I feel like I grew up sort of in between worlds, but in between worlds that were changing and shifting, and there was always a tension. And also I grew up in a suburb, a rural suburb in PA, as one of the only Black students in my class for a really long time at a religious independent Baptist school, and then at a Mennonite high school. And so I think that sense of being other, being viewed as suspect or villainous or monstrous, even not necessarily in the kind of dialed up way that we see in horror, but in the way where you don't fit in. And so to be outside of things and try to understand your embodiment through that, I feel like horror in terms of stories has been like a huge gift. It's also a place to find community. And I think too, like you can't talk about horror and theory and story without talking about Julia Kristeva, who gave us the theory of objection, but she also gave us the theory of intertextuality, which is how we make meaning in conversations between texts of all media, especially in literary studies. And so I think that for me, it started definitely with like being afraid of the devil, being afraid of if we can talk to ghosts or not. And then also like Goosebumps being banned just made it that much more delicious, and having like, copies of Carrie confiscated by my middle school librarian because it wasn't allowed on campus, but I could check it out at the library, the local library. And so I think that kind of swell of want, of finding belonging, but also kind of really the excitement and thrill of being afraid and seeing what happens on the other side of it has been something that even early on I really enjoyed. And I also think too, I have to tip a hat to my dad because he's super into Star Trek. And I grew up as a Trekkie, and I think that science fiction and horror kind of share that speculative glance at the world. It can be really exciting and affirming, especially for people who grew up maybe without as much power as they might want, or as much power as like systems will allow us to have.
Absolutely. I covered Comic Con for this podcast,
Cool.
and there were so many glimpses of everything that you talked about. I mean, I went to a talk where George Takei was the panelist, and he sort of talked about different cast members of Star Trek knowing, like Nichelle Nichols knowing that he was gay and kind of like hinting at it, and him having like heart palpitations because he wasn't out. But then talking to Gene Roddenberry about the potentiality of like having a gay episode right after the Kiss episode between Uhura and Captain Kirk, and he was like, "They're not ready for it. We're going to get banned." But just that those spaces, I mean, and even horror too. I mean, there's a direct intersection. You must know Weird Tales. MTV or Viacom acquired the rights to Weird Tales at one point, and it was John Reed's job to go through all of that content and arrange it chronologically. And he had me help him do that. And so many of those stories were just parables for race, gender inequalities, just like the horror that comes from the other.
Mm-hmm.
So the analog of it all, like, does that being a late millennial, how did that influence your particular taste? Like, what type of genre outside of like maybe Blair Witch, which sort of I think was this whole movement towards the analog, or maybe a retroactive sort of lean towards the analog? Like, what kind of films were and are you drawn to?
Yeah, I think kind of thinking back to what sparked my interest earlier on, I think that it has changed and it hasn't changed. And I think especially every Halloween that seems to come back for me, just because I think that it's a nostalgic time for everyone. I think fall always has that kind of energy to it. It's very back to school. It's very like, oh, I'm thinking of when I came of age, or all the different ways we come of age. But I think for me, with horror, I think the earliest ways that I was introduced into is definitely through the page, through story, through books. I think most definitely it was Goosebumps.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think that like, I mean, I wasn't allowed to watch Buffy, so that was like a great like wound that I wore for a really, really long time until I was in my 20s and decided to like watch it proper the first time it hit Netflix. But I think that being able to kind of read stories was like an entry point. And so I think while a lot of peers were diving into Harry Potter, I was reading Anne Rice and Stephen King. And also, I forget the author's name, but there's this novel that I was like obsessed with and like read it to shreds. It was a YA novel called Blood and Chocolate. It was adapted into a film in the early 2000s. And it's very different than like how it appears on the page, but it was a story about a werewolf teen girl who doesn't fit in. And then what does it mean to show your feral self to someone and they reject you, but then you find your community anyway? And so I think that I definitely noticed that like I am drawn toward even within like the some more sort of a familiar topographies of horror and that genre. I'm really drawn to like the monsters or the otherness or the feralness or the violence or the resilience that isn't often celebrated. So I'm like more of a werewolf person than a vampire person.
Mm-hmm.
I think I definitely like things that are kind of really centering the body and like the porousness and the squelchiness and the inner darkness of the body, metaphorically and literally. I'm really excited that body horror is having a sort of resurgence and an expansion because I think that especially as someone who embodies a body that wasn't always historically viewed as a body, it's an interesting place to kind of find ownership and voice. And it also is an interesting place for those of us who like to kind of push the boundary in terms of structure and aesthetics and voice, and even like language and what that can do on the page, on screen, and otherwise. Because it's also asking about the bodyliness of a text, not just the bodies that are represented or breathed to life through the narrative. And so, yeah, I really love werewolves. I've been watching all of the Howling movies because so many of them are on Tubi right now. And even though they're very campy and they're very 80s and early 90s, I think there's still something nice about looking at a story and not looking for like its weaknesses, but looking for its strengths and where it's pushing things forward or where it undercuts your expectation of where it's going, where it collapses that distance between you and this world of the story and things kind of blur a little bit. So I always ask my students and myself when I'm like reading peers' work or my own work to revise, what residue does it leave on you? There's a really great essay by Toni Morrison. It's called Invisible Ink, where she talks about how can we rattle or disturb our audience. And not just in terms of like, oh, I scared you, jump scare, but like about that expectation of what is stable or static or what we feel entitled to. And also collapsing that passivity and making the page more intimate. Like when you're moving through an unfamiliar space or even your own home when the lights are out, you see everything differently. You have to feel it. You can't just know it. You have to feel it through the body. That sort of resistance that we have to stories and that expectation that all stories are meant to be perfect. Like, I think that that's something that I get so mad about the genre of horror, that like people come to horror and speculative works and anything that maybe has one foot in the real world and maybe the another foot veering elsewhere, that they try to poke holes in it rather than just to bear witness to it and see what that does. So I also am interested in like trying to rewire the expectations of what we come to the page or the screen or the stage with, and being open to devotion rather than ridicule or resistance. Like I'm just tired of people being passive in the glory of story. Like it's more than that, right? So we have to kind of push, kind of be like little kids when they sit down to hear a story and just be open.
I love the word squelchiness. Thank you for that.
Squelching.
Um, yeah, so one thing I really relate to was that whole Stephen King bit that you were talking about, how certain books were banned. When I was a kid, they didn't have Stephen King books in North Carolina. And so, but they did have some of his books under pseudonym. So I was able to read Running Man, but that was not information I found on the internet. A librarian literally slipped me that bit of info. She's like, well, we don't have Stephen King proper, but we do have this. I'm like, okay, that'll do, you know? But in order to conquer my fear from having watched the miniseries of It, I sought out the book It because I felt like there was some sort of way where I could put a stopper on Pennywise if I read him as opposed to just watch him, if that makes sense. Same thing with Freddy Krueger. I went back. I kind of jested about it in the beginning. I do think he is hilarious, and he got way campier as time went on. But it stemmed in fear and me wanting to be able to process it enough that I became immune or something. And then I just ended up finding rapture in it. What did you think about Sinners? I know you said you're more of a werewolf than a vampire, but what do you think about it?
I mean, I feel like we always come to the werewolves via the vampires, or there's always a vampire somewhere, having a much more stable economic life than a werewolf, likely. I think I was really excited when I heard about it, but I also was a little, I don't know, like already like heavy sigh about hearing all of the discourse surrounding it. I think it's important to give room for filmmakers who are, you know, maybe carving out room aesthetically, structurally, tonally, and genre-wise that maybe they haven't explored before in the same way that we give that to white filmmakers, directors, and screenwriters. And so I think that just because your voice isn't as represented in a particular corner of creative expression or media doesn't mean that you should shy away from doing something different or doing something that's the same. And so I think that there was like a tension that I felt as a devotee of horror about Sinners, but then I also was really, really blown away by so much of what I was really not expecting to see. think I love the way temporality was explored and that idea of futurity, and then also the sort of like, I don't know, Afrofuturism and like elements of folklore. But then I also love that it was like Dead by Sunset, is that? But
Dusk to Dawn? Is that
Dusk
the
to
one?
Dawn, yeah.
Yeah,
I'm like, but then I think of like Dead by Dawn. I'm like, no, that's just Evil Dead,
yeah.
Deadite speak. But yeah, so that film comes to mind, and I think that also Lost Boys kind of felt like it was rumbling around and the imprint of some of the kind of campier, violent moments toward the end. But then also like playing around with the expectation that the end is the end, and then also having this beautiful unrushed scene after we kind of think the film has ended. And so I like that there was something structural that was being reimagined in terms of genre. I do think there were some things that, as a genre fan, I think they made certain choices because they wanted it to be a wider audience, and that's okay. But I also really love that we get to see like so many different sort of interpretations of Black identity in terms of desire, sexuality, class, even like intergenerational arcs. And I also really love too that one of our main characters, who then also becomes a vampire, and then also gets to kind of like have three acts really, because she then becomes like a fly girl in the early 90s or late 80s,
Yeah.
which I love. That her earrings are gorgeous. It's like,
Hmm.
yes, but also she reminded me of Sarah Jane's character in Imitation of Life,
Mm.
particularly the one with Lana Turner, the second adaptation on screen, or yeah, the second one, because the earlier one's kind of like much earlier, and her character's name is Pinky, I think, in the earlier adaptation with, I think, Claudette Colbert, but I might be wrong in terms of the names. But I think that there's something really cool about being able to see all of the conversations historically, aesthetically, structurally, and most importantly, culturally, communally. It was a very unapologetically Black movie. And it was
Hmm.
not interested in trying to spell everything out to people if they didn't get it, but it still made room for people to empathize and be present and bear witness to it, even if they aren't necessarily the one that it's singing to. And so I think that there is something really beautiful about that. Um, and so, I mean, I went to see it because I was asked to do a roundup of Black vampires in cinema for an outlet. And so I went to go see it that day, and I had a really shitty day that day when I went. I don't know what was going on. I think it was just the beginning of like almost that week before spring break, and I was just cranky and sleepy, or I don't know what it was, but I went to go see it, and it like really floored me. And I was just like, I cried in the theater in the dark, and it was like this beautiful experience where I was like, I'm glad that I'm a human that exists and gets to see this, even though our president is the worst diva. But film like this still exists, and I love that he also has ownership over it. Because I think that's also an important thing to talk about too. Like, how do people get to have kind of agency over their legacy in terms of their creative work, and not just like, being a blockbuster film, making all the money, breaking even and then some, but also like, do they get to actually have say over where their work goes and like how it's used? And I think that's really important too, to think about like those next steps past the buzz of like the media cycle. How do people get to kind of have protection and like agency over what their work does, and what they get to do with it? Because a lot of times I don't think we talk enough about that for filmmakers, for writers, for musicians, all sorts of creatives. I think that's important too.
I think the highest grossing original screenplay in recent history, which is crazy.
Hmm.
Crazy. I loved it. I had a similar experience. It completely took me by surprise. I kind of knew nothing going into it. I prefer it that way, but I was floored. Haley Steinfeld in particular, like that trope that you were talking about, like with Imitation of Life, there's usually a tragedy to that, to
Hmm.
the mulatto character, and there wasn't that with her. She kind of came out on top, vampire or not. A,
Hmm.
B, you know how you can look at somebody and you're like, they are Black and I know it.
Hmm.
I've always kind of felt that way about her, and that particular like genetic configuration of her grandfather being a black man is true. That's true to life, and they wrote that. Ryan Coogler wrote that into the script. Um, but yeah, the diversity of, I mean, even within the twin set of Black folks, there was a
Hmm.
diversity of type, which was just like a breath of fresh air. And yeah, love that film. Love that film. It's one of those things too that was so intense that I haven't seen it a second time. Have you watched it twice yet?
I have not watched it twice because I think this is where my partner will probably be like, "Why are you telling people this?" But I think I came home once and he was watching Sinners, but he was watching it like really quietly, because I always like to watch them with like the sound all the way up to the point where like I'm probably damaging my hearing or what's left of it from my emo scene days.
Same.
But I was just like, oh no, this is a movie that you have to watch like fully like immersed, like sound is so key. And then he's like,
Hmm.
I'll watch it later. When you're not like watching it, watching me watch it like perched over my shoulder. Because I'm
Yeah.
very much so like that too, but I haven't rewatched yet. I think I'll probably get to it maybe in winter when things get heavy because of
Hmm.
like just like, not a lot of sunlight and like whatever political things lie ahead. I think it's kind of a gift to kind of lean into. So I haven't revisited it yet, but I was thinking about it because I recently saw him, and I think a lot of like conversation around him really frustrated me because I was just like, y'all, if this was a movie about like anyone but a black football player, or like maybe a depiction of blackness that doesn't seem less familiar, or if it was about a white football player, we would love this and we would applaud it and say that it's Lynchian and that it's complex and that it's like Neon Demon meets like Varsity Blues. But instead, everyone said that it was too on the nose, too obvious. And I'm like, but you all are so excited about weapons, and weapons is definitely like almost like a slideshow through different doorways. And I love the episodic structure of it. And I love that it takes place in PA and that it's a zombie film because we
Yeah.
love the original origin of zombie, which we wouldn't get without blackness and black divinatory practices that were exploited and still are being exploited by white storytellers. But I think that there's something really frustrating about seeing someone do the same thing that Sinners did, play around with structure, play around with aesthetics, play around with temporality, and the sensory, and then like people just literally not even paying attention to the film in the theater because I don't know, because I guess if you're not a white, artsy, straight male filmmaker or screenwriter, you can't play with aesthetics, which is something that plagues all corners of creative mediums and expression.
you you have to earn the right to jazz no matter who you are. But if you in particular are any sort of minority, people are going to question whether or not you know what you just did.
Hmm.
And so you have to set up enough of a format and enough of a regularity so that when you divert, it comes off as tactful, not random, right? Unfortunately, but I think film suffers from the same thing. Like if it goes too far outside of the realm of a structure that someone expects, then you are a hack. I think,
Yeah.
especially if you're black. Yeah.
It's so strange to me knowing how everyone was like, and I was one of the people who was just like, oh my God, have you seen David Cronenberg's new movie? I almost didn't fall asleep. Like it was so good. I love it. Shrouds. But even if you think about Videodrome or even
Yeah.
like, his like first kind of almost like prelude to a feature and the kind of longer short of Crimes of the Future,
Mm-hmm.
like, and then of course the more recent like feature length that he says isn't the same, but definitely carries some common language. Um, there are things that he does in that film that like no one ever did before, but like people praise it, right? And of course, when David Lynch passed away, what a loss, but also what a gift of everything he left us. But I think that there's such little room for people to be so open, to people who aren't as associated with like that type of like surreal veering away from linearity, veering away from like mainstream approaches to genre. If it's just really frustrating because it's like, do you expect us all to just come through and like, I don't know, everything can't be Get Out. And even when Get Out came out, people were like completely like just gobsmacked because they were confused. And it's like, that's also objection. Why are you so confused? Why are you recoiling away from this thing that if we swapped out the identity, of course, it would change to the context of the
Mm-hmm.
meaning of the story, but then you would be more open to it. Or if we said that like a white filmmaker made the new Candyman or the more recent Candyman, then somehow a lot of the critique around it would probably be a little less harsh. Because I'm sorry, like so many of these other reimaginings of franchises that already existed, they're not doing as much to rebuild the world and reimagine it and add something new, to add more nuance, right? They're just kind of regurgitating the same thing. And people are like, it was so good. I loved it. It was amazing. And it's like, why are we saying that? Is it because the
Mm-hmm.
people at the helm were more comfortable with this type of approach or them taking up space? But I think I'm always really mad about wherever I am, whenever I am, I'm always sulking inside myself about how people do not expect uh, things that aren't mostly represented in mainstream culture when it comes to people who are less represented or people who are marginalized or less supported. And that's frustrating because if I go to a writing retreat full of Black writers, there better be somebody writing mainstream thrillers. There better be somebody like writing body horror, somebody writing like really hybrid, like auto-fictive stuff where everybody knows that they're writing about their friends and their frenemies. Like it has to be all of it. We can't just all be speaking in the same octave, same voice. Even though him didn't sort of, I don't know, make the touchdown. I'm like trying so hard to make like a sports reference that it was
Yeah.
that folks maybe hoped for it to do.
Go
I still
Eagles.
think that it, yeah, go birds. I think that like it still did something that I felt affirmed by, even just its use of color, its use of sound, the way that it also felt like a beautiful way of affirming the Black male body. And like, and that doesn't center me. It's not necessarily supposed to center me, but it made me think more tenderly about how what I do share in common with people who would feel more centered by that text. And the ending was hilarious and so bonkers. And like Julia Fox was like such a such a strange monster. And so I kind of also like too how people play around with tone more now because we are living in really like WTF times. So I think there's something fun about playing around with tone where it's really serious and then it goes really wild, kind of like the end of the substance. And then it goes back to kind of maybe something a little more revelatory that we have room for many notes of tone.
So I want to go back a little bit to sort of mention your different touch points you've had with religion and how that sort of is reflected in some of the film and literature that you're drawn to. And I'm one of those kids that read the Bible on my own volition. Like my family's not religious whatsoever, but I got my hands on a picture Bible and was like transfixed. And then later in life got R. Crumb's Book of Genesis and was
Mm,
just like, oh my God, this is perfect. Like this makes complete and utter sense because there is something inherently well crude about it because it is so
hmm
raw and graphic in a matter of fact way, but then also the idea the morality in it is as grotesque as he draws his characters. Um, what other types of films do you think sort of straddle that intersection, or not even just films, in any sort of media or text sort of straddle that um, area well? And then also, I guess as an aside, you mentioned Toni Morrison. Do you read much like? I mean, I guess there's like Southern Gothic or American Gothic. I guess that's the subgenre, right? Which I squarely fit Toni Morrison in,
hmm
for sure, for the detail alone. I mean, I love her. I mean, I think what you quoted earlier was her nonfiction, right?
hmm I love Toni Morrison. There's a Toni Morrison class. And I think they are finishing up Beloved and diving into Sula soon. And I like heard them chatting about it. And I was just like, oh my God, I feel like Sula is the coolest, like sapphic fire starter, like portrait of like a will they, won't they friendship growing up story. And I wish I could see it on the screen because it's just like that moment of grief at the end of the novel, a grief that has no top or bottom to it. It's more than just friendship. It's more than just sisterhood. It's like this kind of fruition of like yearning that doesn't quite get to take root. And I think they both kind of fracture off and have these different paths of dealing with that limitation of the town that hems them in. I just ended up teaching that short story by Baldwin, The Outing. And like the end of that short story, when it says, where once there was safety, there was now danger, and like a flower opening. And I feel like that's kind of what I think Sula is kind of circling around in a different way. But yeah, I think Morrison is like one of the greatest writers ever, always, of course. All genres, every form, even that one long short story that somehow her publishers like finally got to the masses with that beautiful foreword by Zadie Smith. But I think that I feel like I tend to kind of zoom into aspects of her fiction specifically that I think often don't necessarily, they're not like necessarily celebrated, but I think they're not as dominant, in the sense that like, yes, she's writing within the Southern Gothic and like she's definitely kind of a corrective and a remedy and also singing a part of the chorus of what we get from Faulkner and like other writers of that, right? And also like Flannery O'Connor. And even I would say Carson McCullers and like writers like that. But I think that there's also something really interesting about her work that also has to do with class and also aesthetics, and also like sort of outsiderness even within a group that you're a part of. And so I
Mhm.
think that like that's something that I think people often forget, that like although yes, she writes a lot about this space of the Southern Gothic and in that tradition and the American canon and in the Black American canon and the larger literary canon, she's also writing about rural suburban Ohio. And she also is a daughter of rural suburban Ohio, right? And so I
Mhm.
think for me, as someone from a rural suburb, not Ohio, Pennsylvania, the other Ohio, I think that that's something that I'm always fixated on. Like, what permission does that give me to carve out a canon or carve out space to be a voice alongside something that might be the main sort of reference point in an appendix, but there could be a footnote, and that footnote is like a variation or a riff on that. I think other texts that like maybe intersect religion and horror, I think I'm really drawn to Miriam Tave's work. Um, I think there's something about the way she evokes the body, but also trauma, and also like specifically religious trauma and how people reclaim their voice. I think Women Talking was a really formative novel for me to read as a reader, but also as a writer because of the structure. And I've been really like hooked on the way structure can be a way of getting us close to things that maybe we can't touch within ourselves, but also we have trouble reckoning with through language, whether it's through story, through lived experience, or through our own memory, or what our body remembers, but we don't have language for. And then I really love Daisy Johnson's work, and Olga Ravin. None of those writers are Black, but I think that I just don't see it. I know it's there. I have the Jordan Peele anthology of horror. I think Leslie Nanique Erma is probably one of the writers who gets closest to what I need and what I crave as a reader and as a writer, aesthetically, tonally, structurally. But I just feel like I don't know if it's because the market is such a thing that barely gives room for any writer, let alone a writer of who's writing from different traditions that aren't as well represented within the industry. Um, I think maybe another writer, because I'm seeing an arc of her book like staring me down, like, why are you not mentioning me? Is Zinzi Clemens' novel What We Lose, which is a novel about loss and grief, but it's written in these kind of like flashes of memory and dream, and it veers on the surreal. It has an image from Imitation of Life. It has a photo of the Manson girls. It has graphs, charts, and it's a way of having all these different ways to kind of access what it means when you lose someone and what that means in terms of losing a part of yourself and what's on the other side of that. And so I think traversing the abject through structure, through tone, through voice and aesthetics, not just in terms of uh recap of the plot of the story or theme, feels really important to me. And I don't know. I love realism. I think that like traditional mainstream literary fiction is cool, but I just need something weirder because I'm super
Yeah,
weird. I
it's
just need
hard. It's
something
hard.
stronger.
It's hard to like find things directly because of the stratification of everything and the odd like categorization of things that shouldn't be where they're categorized. I mean,
Mhm.
I do you know Kathleen Collins? Do you
Kathleen
know her?
Collins, yeah.
Love her, and
Oh,
you
her
know
stories are super scary, super spooky.
super scary, and just like also really short. There's a through line of a feel. I have no idea how to categorize any of it.
Yeah.
It
No, I
feels
think
like
it
the
comes from
same
her being a screenwriter.
yeah, yeah, exactly. It's super cinematic. You feel like it's the same protagonist, but it definitely is not each time. And she deals with the body a lot, the black body in particular. But I stumbled upon her during COVID just through a book exchange, like a book
Oh,
swap,
wow.
like a global book swap. And I got this random book, and I was like, "Holy fuck, who is this woman?" Percival Everett, I really love his work, but I've been a fan of his work for so long, and so I haven't found anybody else that kind of fills that point for
Mhm.
me. I mean, I love George Saunders, and he's pretty straightforward, but
I'm
like
so adverse to George Saunders because when I did my MFA at the New School, everyone was so obsessed with him. So I was like, no,
that's the
I want to be
thing.
different.
I feel trite. I feel trite as hell. But you know, but he speaks to me. You know, and also my attention span is built for short stories. Like
Yeah, no, totally.
I can't
I
with a
feel like I'm
novel.
trying to remember the name of the short story in Kathleen Collins' collection, but do you remember the story about the girl who like goes to live with her family and they're all like varying shades of like
Yes, the
slightness because yeah,
yes, yeah,
so
absolutely.
scary. That is like such like a like Flannery O'Connor, like Morrison and Faulkner horror story, like definitely like American horror story type like narrative. And it's fascinating how like even just like something that as small as like dust on like a side table in the sunroom or something can evoke like this larger portrait of the family. But I think it comes directly from her awareness of like how every single thing has to be much like what she says in the titular story wired for sound, right?
Hmm.
Like every single thing, because that's what you do in cinema. Like even when people aren't looking at it, they're looking at it. And so I think like learning from other mediums and how we can pour that into the different places that we make meaning or even, pull meaning from as consumers of media and story. It's such a feast. There's so much room. Yeah, her
I
work is
love
like wild.
I love when you said that the form can sort of explain things that we don't have the words to explain. I think that often that's such a great go-to when you know it should be formatted this way, but you don't need to know why, but you know it just fits. Like I think
Hmm.
that definitely translates. Losing Ground, that is one of my favorite movies because there's a whole like sort of eeriness to it because it almost feels like a daydream that
Hmm.
goes sort of out of whack. But then, not to mention, it occurred to me the other day when I was seeing that panel for Vampire Freaks with the BIPOC vampire folks. The guy who played Blackula is
Hmm.
the aristocratic sort of dance guy with that she meets in the library. The actor,
Yeah.
yeah.
It almost feels like too that like he could exist in the same world where he like experienced that, became a or like and then somehow like became a vampire and went on to like it just seems like and then it also feels similar to like even with Ganja and Hess, like some of the things that take shape in that. Like it seems like that kind of not trope, but like that kind of shape of a character in that
Mhm.
particular era, pressurized specifically by setting or confinement, whether it's a house or a weekend or a relationship or a coffin.
Or a job,
But it's
yeah,
like
yeah.
it's kind of elevating things or amplifying it.
That's hilarious. That that film set pushed
It's just like he's just a character stressed out, trying to like
that.
it's a Sisyphusian like vampiric imperative. I
That's
think one name I
hilarious.
forgot to say, and I feel bad for forgetting. I like my brain is like it's not even mid-October yet, and I'm like already like a wagon losing its wheels. I went through like a weird like Little House on the Prairie phase during the summer, so like it just
Come
comes to mind
on.
because that happens in one of the episodes. These kids watch as a wagon loses its wheels and their parents plummet to their death on a cliff. We love a weird, awful manifest destiny reimagining of the West, but
Yeah,
um
decades long.
Tanana Reeve Dew is a person that I think definitely like I'm so grateful for her work. I got to be in a workshop of hers at Vona way back when, and I think it was at a time where it was like in between my first and second year in my MFA, and at the new school the MFA program is 2 years. And so it was that first summer, first year done, workshop, feedback given, lots of feedback not given, silences, questions, not from my professors, but from my peers that made me feel a little bruised, a little triggered. And it was just nice to be in a space of other folks who were writing outside of what was expected, not just in terms of the literary canon, but even within their own respective identities and communities and traditions. And then also hearing directly from Tananarive about the power of being able to be in community with Octavia Butler and like Jill Gomez and like so many people that are just like really like the giants who've carved out place for a place for people like me, hopefully someday to write within. But I also still am like such a weirdo for like form and I'm a little bit of a deconstructionist. So I oftentimes like am just craving like the weirdest shit structurally and narratively. So sometimes that means that some of the folks that people like go to in their mind first, I'm just like, yeah, they're on my bookshelf, but like what if we built a hole in the middle of the book and we lifted up the page and inside are words and you have to pour them out and put them back together?
That's amazing.
Now it's time for the segment House of Ultraviolet Walks. In this segment, we, the House of Ultraviolet, highlight great literary legends in ballroom culture. Today we're highlighting Disidentifications, Queers of Color, and the Performance of Politics by the late, great Jose Esteban Munoz. This book is like an antidote to Judith Butler's ideas surrounding ball culture and its performativity and its need to pass, and it reads just like the antidote it is. On page 109, it tackles the idea of realness. Realness functions as an intervention in the history of cross-race desire that saturates the phenomenon of passing. Passing is parodied, and this parody becomes a site where interracial desire is interrogated. This book is a scaffolding or a foundation that other books like Marlon Bailey's Butch Queen Up in Pumps and my book, and the category is, stands on. So, to Jose Esteban Munoz, thank you for walking literary, legendary realness. Let's get back to the show.
Okay, so we're nearing towards the end, and I have a signature question I'm going to ask every guest. What is one thing that you know or see that you wish the rest of the world knew or saw?
I think this is something that if anyone who's hung out with me for more than 10 minutes, they'll be like, oh, here she goes again, her song that she sings. Fear is a teacher, and so is grief. And that's not an easy thing to hold, but we know it's true. I think that's the greatest gift of what Chris Saba gives us through objection. That's the greatest gift of what all of the revelatory, prophetic even, Black femme writers and queer writers have taught me. Like, if you can look at something and be afraid of it and acknowledge that fear and acknowledge what that brings up in you, it changes your perspective to being present with yourself, with a text, with others, with community. And grief is also a teacher in the same way because it's another unknown. It's shrouded. And the real term of like what revelation means, like the book of Revelation in the Bible, is pulling something back, right? So instead of pulling the covers over our heads, maybe peek down, even if it's like gradual. It can be a slow burn, jump scare, but reckon with it because it helps you understand like what you maybe have been circling around but haven't been willing to move through, and it builds resilience. I think it's another way of being in your body and being in community alongside other bodies. So I think that that's partially the joy of like community with horror, but also what it means to be in communion with narrative in whatever form you enjoy it most.
That's perfect. Thank you so much. Where can the people find you?
I'm on Instagram. My handle is Girl Afraid, but you can just look for me and I'll pop up often next to a pumpkin or an image of Shari Belafonte from The Midnight Hour as a vampire.
Beautiful. Well, that's way too specific to miss. So thank you very much.
Very welcome.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you, Dianca London Potts, for such an engaging conversation. I hope to have you on either every Halloween or even, before the next one, just to talk more about your ideas on films that are coming out. Follow Dianca London Potts at Girl Afraid on most social platforms, and follow us at Outsider In Podcast on Instagram. Join us next week when we are going to do a very special remote episode at New York City Comic Con. You won't want to miss that one. Until then, take care.